There is a video circulating right now claiming the new Fed chair has a secret plan to quietly cancel your mortgage debt, tied to some vague $40 trillion figure. I looked for a source behind that claim. There is not one. What I found instead is the real story, and it is almost the exact opposite of what that title promises. The new Fed chair's actual documented track record points toward higher rates for longer, not some hidden debt cancellation plan. And if you are trying to time a home purchase or a refinance around this transition, you need the real picture, not the version designed purely to get you to click. Quick thing before we get into it. I check financial claims against actual voting records, actual Fed statements, and actual economic data before they go in a script, not against whatever framing performs best. If that is useful, subscribe and turn on the bell. 2 seconds, and let's get into who this person actually is and what his record actually says. On May 13th, 2026, the Senate confirmed Kevin Warsh as the new chair of the Federal Reserve, replacing Jerome Powell on a 54-45 vote. Warsh is not a newcomer to the Fed. He served as a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors from 2006 to 2011, the youngest governor in the Fed's history at the time of his appointment. He resigned in 2011 specifically because he opposed a second round of quantitative easing, the Fed's bond-buying stimulus program, even though he had actually voted in favor of the first round despite having concerns about it. Before his Fed service, Warsh worked as a financial advisor at Morgan Stanley, then served as a special assistant to President George W. Bush and executive secretary of the National Economic Council. He studied economics and statistics at Stanford before attending Harvard Law School. Here is the part that matters most for understanding what actually comes next. Throughout his time at the Fed and in the years since, Warsh has been consistently described as a hawk, meaning someone who leans toward higher interest rates to control inflation rather than lower rates to stimulate growth, and someone who has historically expressed real skepticism about the Fed buying large quantities of mortgage debt or government bonds. This matters enormously because President Trump has been vocal about wanting the Fed to cut interest rates more aggressively, and a common assumption going around is that Trump appointed Warsh specifically to deliver those cuts. Warsh's own actual track record cuts directly against that assumption. His documented philosophy leans toward reducing the Fed's balance sheet and maintaining independence from political pressure, not toward the kind of aggressive rate cutting some people expected simply because Trump made the appointment. Warsh held his first press conference as Fed chair on June 17th, and the actual substance of it reinforces this pattern rather than contradicting it. He held rates steady at that first meeting. More tellingly, the Fed's own internal projections released around that meeting showed 9 out of 18 Fed officials signaling support for raising rates before the end of 2026, with 6 of them specifically penciling in 2 separate quarter-point rate hikes. Inflation was sitting at 4.2% at the time, and the Fed under Warsh has been explicitly prioritizing inflation control over the kind of forward guidance and rate-cutting signals markets had been hoping for. None of this looks like the setup for the kind of mortgage relief the fake claim promises. If anything, it points toward the opposite. Now let's get into why mortgage rates specifically might actually move in the wrong direction under this new leadership, because this is where the real, technical story gets genuinely interesting, and it has nothing to do with debt cancellation. Mortgage rates do not move in perfect lockstep with the Fed's benchmark interest rate. They are also heavily influenced by the spread between mortgage-backed securities and Treasury bonds, essentially the extra return investors demand to hold mortgage debt instead of government debt. One concrete example from earlier this year illustrates this well. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were directed to purchase roughly $200 billion in mortgage-backed securities, and that specific intervention brought those spreads back down to around 1.8%, close to the historical norm, which is a meaningful part of why mortgage rates in early 2026 were not sitting at 6.5% or higher. If Warsh follows through on his documented preference for aggressively reducing the Fed's overall balance sheet, that kind of support for mortgage-backed securities could shrink, those spreads could widen again, and mortgage rates could move upward even if the Fed's own benchmark rate stays exactly where it is. Here is something worth understanding structurally, regardless of who the Fed chair happens to be. The Fed chair does not set interest rates unilaterally. Rate decisions are made by the Federal Open Market Committee, a body of 12 voting members, meaning Warsh is one vote among 12, not a single person with the power to move markets purely through personal preference, however strong that preference might be. This matters directly against both the fake claim we opened with and against the opposite, equally oversimplified assumption that Trump picked Warsh and therefore rates are guaranteed to fall soon. Neither extreme accurately describes how this actually works. So what should you actually do with this information if you are trying to make a real decision about buying a home or refinancing right now? I am not a financial advisor, and this is not personalized advice, but here is the factual landscape worth weighing. Most economists surveyed on this question do not expect meaningful rate drops until late 2026 at the earliest, and some push that timeline into 2027, a timeline that has not shifted meaningfully despite the change in Fed leadership. If you can genuinely afford the payment on a home at today's rates and you plan to stay in it for several years, waiting specifically for a rate drop that may not materialize on any predictable timeline carries its own real cost in the form of continued rent payments, potential home price appreciation in the meantime, or simply lost time. If your plans are more flexible, or you are specifically betting on a rate decrease within a shorter window, the actual documented record on Warsh gives you less reason for optimism about a near-term drop than the popular narrative around his appointment might suggest. Step back and look at the actual gap between the fake version of this story and the real one. The fake version promises a secret, dramatic form of relief, a hidden plan to cancel your mortgage debt tied to a huge, vague number. The real version is less dramatic and considerably more useful. A Fed chair with a long, public, checkable record of hawkish, inflation-focused positions, taking over at a moment when inflation is still running above target, heading a committee where he holds only one vote among 12, whose actual first moves as chair point toward caution and even potential rate increases rather than cuts. That real version will not get the same number of alarmed comments, but it happens to be checkable against his actual voting record, his actual public statements, and the Fed's own actual published projections, none of which support the version currently circulating. If this helped you separate what is actually documented from what is just a dramatic hook with nothing behind it, hit like so it reaches other people trying to make a real decision about a home purchase or refinance based on accurate information, and subscribe if you have not, because I will keep tracking Warsh's actual votes and statements as Fed chair, not the exaggerated version of his record circulating elsewhere. Tell me in the comments whether you are currently waiting on rates before making a move, because that tells me exactly how deep to go on the mortgage-backed securities mechanics next.